Good afternoon, friends. I hope you are all practicing responsibility and staying safe out there. Well, today I want to continue our study in the book of Luke by looking at a story out of the book of Luke in chapter 19 from verses 11 through 28. I want to ask you to read that on your own a little while later. It's a story similar to a more famous one told in Matthew chapter 25 that we know as the parable of the talents. But this story also has some unique variances and a slightly different message to it. Jesus was known to use similar imagery in other stories, depending on the context and so forth. Now, to set up some context for our story in Luke 19, Jesus is just a few miles from Jerusalem. There was great anticipation and excitement among his followers, who still did not quite fully grasp exactly how this whole kingdom plan was supposed to go down. They were expecting Jesus just to walk into Jerusalem and use his miraculous power to overthrow the Roman government and finally establish a forever kingdom. The purpose of this story was to show that things weren't exactly going to go down that way, but also I think to show them that the way things do eventually go down would not be the end of the story, even though it may look like it at the time. In this story in Luke 19, Jesus talks about a high-ranking nobleman who is about to go off to a distant country to be crowned king. Before leaving, he calls together his servants and he distributes about 3 months' wages to each of them, with the charge to invest it while he's gone. He doesn't say specifically how to do this. In fact, he seems to give them a lot of leeway and freedom in that regard. However, one curveball to the story is that while many of the citizens that he was going to rule over lived there, many of them hated him, and they wanted to send a delegation to oppose him in his appointment as a king. Now, what's interesting here is that Jesus' original audience would have had some unique familiarity with this concept from an event that took place about 3 decades before. You might remember Herod the Great. He was the one who tried to have Jesus killed as a baby. Well, when he died, he willed that his area of authority and responsibility be divided up into 3 territories to give each to one of his living sons. The largest of those divisions, which included about half of the entire thing, was the territory of Judea and Samaria. His last second choice for that position was a son by the name of Archelaus. Because Israel was under Roman rule, though, Herod the Great's plan and will had to be approved by Caesar Augustus. But most of the people hated Archelaus because he was self-indulgent and cruel. In fact, he had had over 3,000 of his own citizens killed not long before that. In fact, he was the reason that Joseph and Mary, when they came back from Egypt, decided to go on to Nazareth instead of living again in Bethlehem, because as Matthew tells us, Joseph feared Archelaus. In addition to Archelaus' brothers who opposed him and also were the inheritors of the other 2 parts of the kingdom, about 50 Jewish leaders also went to Rome to oppose his selection. However, Augustus ratified the plan and Archelaus was put into position, but he was never actually given the title king. And history would show that the concerns of the brothers and of the Jewish citizens eventually proved to be valid, as he turned out to be a horrible and cruel ruler. But that's about where the historical similarities end in our story. The nobleman in this story goes off to this distant country and he gets crowned king and he eventually returns. And when he calls together his servants to get their reports, the focus really is only on 3 of them because they're kind of representative of all of them. One servant that the king talked to took what he had been giving and he produced a 1,000% return. Boy, wouldn't you like to have that guy investing your money right now in this market? Another servant showed a 500% return. And to each of these servants, he gave them additional responsibilities equivalent to their productivity levels. But a third servant showed no return whatsoever. In fact, he didn't even make an effort. He basically hid his money under the mattress. Oh, he tried to make it sound good. See, master, I didn't lose it. Here it is. But the king would have none of it. He was furious because the man made no effort and took no risk. To make matters worse, he actually blamed the king himself for his own lack of action, calling him, in effect, a mean bully that judged too harshly and caused fear. And nothing was further from the truth. He had misunderstood and mischaracterized the king. But the king showed him that no matter what excuse he used, no matter how he mischaracterizes him, his own words were inconsistent with his own lack of making the choice to do something. If he thought the king was that cruel, then why wouldn't he do anything he could to avoid suffering the wrath? He knew the king expected a good effort regardless of the results, but instead he didn't do anyone any good. So the king took the money away from him and he gave it to the top performer, which seemed a little unfair to some of the observers, but we'll get to that later. Then the king dealt with all those who refused to be subject to him in the way that kings of those days did. The defiance could only lead to one result, their death. Now, what do we learn from this story that we can really take to heart? Well, several things, actually. First, the man of high rank and nobility is obviously a reference to Jesus himself. After the events that would take place over the next few weeks in Jerusalem, meaning his crucifixion, he would indeed go off to a distant place to be crowned king. But it wouldn't be Rome, Italy. It would be heaven. He would be placed king or given the crown by God the Father. Secondly, unlike the story of Matthew 25, where the distribution of talents is actually divided among the servants differently, the money here is divided evenly. The point of that is that every one of us has an equal opportunity for grace and an equal responsibility to be a part of the kingdom investment strategy, or to put it another way, to participate in the work of the church. However, not everyone is going to have the same kind of influence or impact or even results. And guess what? That's okay. Notice the king never compares the two productive servants. He never made it a competition. He never criticized the guy who made a little bit less. He didn't question why he couldn't be like the other guy. He never scolded him because his return wasn't as great. And I think that's the reason why he's actually included in this story, to show that not everyone is wired or gifted in the same way. And I think that's the purpose of the differences in the Matthew 25 story. Some are just given the gifts to have a greater responsibility. And by the way, that's not a reference to pastors of bigger churches having more responsibility as so much. God doesn't measure the value of our work based on the size of our congregation. But that's a different story for a different day. The point here is that both accepted the grace they were shown and the responsibility they were given, and they both took the risk necessary to show they made an effort. But the third guy didn't seem to take the king seriously, possibly assumed he was never coming back, and foolishly did nothing. He was the one that the king scolded. In fact, the lazy servant in the Matthew 25 story was treated just like the citizens of this story. He was cast out. Why? Well, because in both stories, the third servant incorrectly pigeonholed the king as an ungraceful, overbearing ruler. Had he listened and opened his eyes and his heart, he would have realized that, yes, sometimes the perfect king has to show wrath when necessary, but it's usually only meant for those, or reserved for those, who reject him altogether, many of whom characterize the king in the very same way that the third servant did. Now, one important thing I want to add to this story. Jesus also said in Matthew 7 that when the time comes to give an account, the Lord, or many people will call the Lord by that name, by the Lord, and he will not recognize him. They will claim that they did all kinds of work in his name, and they would still be rejected. Why? Well, because an integral part of kingdom living isn't just about staying busy or being busy in the public work of the church, which is important, and that's what this story emphasizes. But it's also about living obediently and uncompromisingly in our own private life. There's an important balance to navigate responsibly between our public life and our private life as followers of Jesus. So here's 3 applications I want you to walk away with today. First and foremost, embrace the king's grace. Don't make the mistake of mischaracterizing him as an overbearing and ungraceful king, because nothing can be further from the truth. Secondly, handle responsibly the responsibilities that the king assigns you. And don't get caught up in competition or comparison games, because he certainly doesn't. And third, make sure you balance your public work in the church with the obedience and character development in your private life. Until next time, friend, stay safe. I love you.